I feel very strongly about agriculture and our natural resource sector more broadly, Erin. And in my platform, in my efforts to be elected as the leader of the Conservative Party, I have put our natural resource sector, but specifically agriculture, very much as the centerpiece of economic recovery.
Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 7 of Fireside Chats with Erin. I'm your host, Erin Gowerluck. As Executive Director of the Grain Growers of Canada, I started this podcast to serve as a forum for real conversations with industry influencers and policymakers. Our guest today is here to talk about his vision for our country as someone who hopes to one day lead it. Peter MacKay has a long history in politics. He was leader of the Progressive Conservative Party, and together with Stephen Harper, merged that party with the Canadian Alliance in 2003 to form the Conservative Party of Canada that we know today. Mr. MacKay is currently running to replace Andrew Scheer as leader of the party, and serving as an MP for 18 years, holding multiple cabinet positions, which included Minister of Foreign Affairs, Defence, and Justice. Mr. MacKay, thank you for stopping by today for a fireside chat.
It's my pleasure, Erin, although in the heat of summer, we don't need a fire, that's for sure.
No, it's close to about 30 degrees here in the nation's capital today, so we'll do that some other time.
Another time. Well, pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. I know that you are from a rural area in Nova Scotia, so I'd like to start maybe by giving you an opportunity to speak a little bit about your rural roots, what agriculture means to you and to the folks that you know back home.
Sure. Well, firstly, thank you. I appreciate being with you and having a chance to chat. I did grow up in a rural Nova Scotia riding, northern Nova Scotia towards Cape Breton, Pictou County. And yes, grew up on a farm with my father, my parents, and my grandparents before me. We'd been there about 4 generations. And so, yes, it's a way of life. Rural life, of course, much different than growing up in a city or a larger town. We had animals, we had beef cattle, we made our own hay, we grew our own vegetables, as did everyone around us, and we all pitched in. That was one of the great things about the community is I remember as kids, we would all go and help the other farms make hay in the summer, and it was a chance to make a little bit of money as well. And, that was instilled in me very early that, the food came from the ground, the hay on our fields fed our cattle. It was a very self-sustaining lifestyle. And it is that way of life, I think, right across the country. Now, commercial farms, of course, and dairy farms, big farms, much different. And the fishery, of course, on the East Coast was a big part of that lifestyle as well. So I had lots of friends in school and was very aware of the importance of the fishery. But it sounds trite to say, but you're closer to nature in that type of setting, in that community. And, as I matured and entered professional life, you certainly become aware of the enormity of the agriculture sector in Canada. It is such an important part of our economy. It's such an important part of Canada's contribution to the world because we are very much global leaders in agribusiness, as we are in the fishery. Unfortunately, I think it's fair to say in the last 5 years, Canada has lost some ground. The agribusiness, I know, has faced a lot of challenges. I'm aware of that, speaking to contacts within the sector. And I think, not just as a result of COVID-19, although this has certainly contributed to the challenge, some of the market opportunities have been lost. I think it's fair to say that transportation and transportation infrastructure have created big challenges, including what we saw with the blockade and the lockdown. And that's been a real challenge, an impediment to growth in the ag sector. And so I feel very strongly about agriculture and our natural resource sector more broadly, Erin. And in my platform, in my efforts to be elected as the leader of the Conservative Party, I have put our natural resource sector, but specifically agriculture, very much as the centerpiece of economic recovery. And we can talk a little bit about that, but I certainly intend to stand up for our food producers. They deliver thousands of paychecks to somewhere in the range of 300,000 Canadian workers across the country. And I know some of it is seasonal. I know we often have temporary foreign workers as well as part of our production. But I will certainly stand with farm families. If there is a slogan that resonates with me, if you ate today, thank a farmer.
Thank you. You have outlined a number of topics that I do hope we're going to have an opportunity to touch on today. So let's dive into the first one. You talked about some of our market access challenges, and I want to ask you, we have faced a number around the world, and many of these are caused by non-tariff trade barriers, for example. Examples of that would be more recently in China with canola and Italy with durum wheat. Other barriers appear to be driven by diplomatic tensions. And we can look at examples like Saudi Arabia and India. As Prime Minister, how would you go about resolving these market access challenges while also working to expand and diversify markets around the world for grains, oilseeds, and pulses?
So, Erin, it's as simple and as complicated as the Prime Minister and the Minister of Agriculture and Trade Minister having very direct contact with counterparts in those countries and others. So, for example, we lost about $5 billion in market access as a result of, as you referenced, canola, soybeans, just in China alone. Mm-hmm. And that situation, to be nonpartisan, isn't entirely to rest with the current government, because we are caught in this very difficult dynamic between the United States and China. We have this unique situation where a Chinese CFO, Ms. Men Wanzhou, was held in custody on an extradition request to the United States. We have Canadians in custody in China. But at the source of all of this, many of these barriers are, as you referenced, are not anything to do with the quality of Canadian commodities. That is a false premise that was presented in particular by China. We need to put that to rest, and we need to say loudly and proudly as often as possible, we make the best products in the world when it comes to our ag products. There is no difficulty with quality. That was completely fabricated and a justification on the part of China for what was really a retaliatory decision on their part. And it was punitive, and it was meant to punish Canada, but it specifically and unfortunately punished our ag sector. So barriers to these issues are sometimes related to political blunders and misadventures, if I can call it that. What we saw happen with Mr. Trudeau on his trip to India was, in my experience, a disaster. Dressing up, taking somebody who was convicted of political assassination with you as part of your entourage to India. It was by all measure, a terrible foreign trip abroad to India, which is an enormously important trade partner. An opportunity in India to grow our access to their market is something we need to really take seriously, especially in things like lentils and soybeans and corn. There is an enormous market for Canada in India. And that would be, to me, that would be a priority target country for us to increase market access. So you need to pursue trade deals. You need to do everything you can to open up new markets. And India, as I said, would be at the top of the list. And I would focus on, having key ministers with you on those trips. So if you're trying to close the deal, having the key ministers, agriculture and trade, but also importantly, having representatives of agriculture itself, having representatives of the various grains and commodities, and if it's beef that you're trying to sell or pork, you need to have individuals who have intimate knowledge of the sector itself on those trips, at the table, as part of the pitch and part of the sale. I've led trade missions before when I was a minister from Atlantic Canada, and we were opening up Atlantic Canada as a gateway into our country. And so we brought a lot of our key ministers with us at that time, and provincial ministers too, I'm quick to add. So just to close out this particular issue, I think reliable infrastructure and the ports, countries need to know that they're going to be able to have that regular supply. They need to know that it's reliable. We saw, unfortunately, reputational harm during that blockade. And that undermines the impression that we have a dependable supply chain, that we're going to be able to supply the necessary commodities. Customers, those other countries want to know that the commitment is there, that it's real, that your ports, your rail, your infrastructure is going to be sustainable, and that it won't be vulnerable to interruptions, whether they be strikes or these illegal blockades. You need to be able to ensure that access. And legislation to block to prevent illegal blockades is one thing that's in discussion, but it's enforcement. We have laws in place right now, Erin. I'm a former Crown attorney. When it came to those illegal blockades, there needed to be a clear signal to police forces that those blockades could not continue. Putting debris on a railway is no different than putting a spike belt across the Trans-Canada Highway or running a chain across a runway at an airport. It's intolerable and it's illegal, and it has to be dealt with quickly. We had a lot of harm done, not only to the existing transportation of commodities in that period, but the reputational harm is what worries me.
And you talked about that in your platform specifically. You talked about being a champion for agriculture, and you spoke specifically to wanting to remove the obstacles that have hampered the agri-food industry, such as grain backlogs, rail strikes, illegal blockades. You went on to talk about punitive tax policy, export limitations. But I'd like to know maybe more specifically, what would you have done in those instances if we anticipate further blockades, for example? What, as Prime Minister, would you do to mitigate the overall impact of those blockades?
Well, as I said, quite simply, the signal has to come from the top. That delay in police action will not be acceptable. In that particular instance, at the risk of sounding partisan, the Prime Minister was out of the country at the beginning of that blockade period, and it festered and it went on. He was away, I believe, still pursuing the Security Council seat at the United Nations. It has to be top priority. Your critical infrastructure cannot be interrupted. It cannot be blockaded, even with strikes. You may recall that when we were in government in 2012, we brought in legislation that was very much aimed at, in some cases, having punitive measures against the rail providers themselves if they didn't get those commodities moving. So there's an urgency. There's an absolute impediment on the government to intervene and to ensure that commodities are moving. And that's what I'm committed to. I don't believe we necessarily need more legislation. We need enforcement. And we need a Prime Minister who will send a clear signal, not one that is equivocating or suggesting that more negotiation is needed. It's intolerable. It's like taking hostages. You cannot negotiate in that circumstance. You need to say, remove the debris from the rail. It's unacceptable that happens.
Thank you. Let's talk a little bit about how we support Canadian farmers through some of these challenging times. Canadian farmers are accustomed to facing many ups and downs, and while they hope not to, occasionally they rely on government-run business risk management programs to get through challenging times. GGC has repeatedly stressed to the federal government that Agri Stability is the program that we believe is the most effective way to provide support to farmers who are most in need, regardless of what they grow and what they raise. However, the program trigger and payouts were reduced in 2012 under a previous Conservative government. Since that time, we have seen that many Canadian farmers have simply chosen to opt out of the program, and participation rates hover around the 30% mark now. Over the last couple of years, we have been calling on the government to return the program to the 85% trigger level and remove the reference margin limits. As Prime Minister, would you be willing to enhance Agri Stability and improve the business risk management programs in place to support farmers when they need it?
So, Erin, you're right to suggest that there has been a number of changes, certainly in recent years, and the landscape under which farmers and the whole ag sector has been laboring under the current Liberal government is much different than it was back in 2012 when that decision was taken by a Conservative government. And the changes made to the Agri Stability under the last Conservative government happened at a time when these, let's call them disruptions, these bigger challenges, they didn't exist. So the difference back in 2012, Jerry Ritz was our minister at that time. The marketplace was delivering. Farmers in Canada were thriving, I dare say, and that was a good thing. And there was so the demand on the Agri Stability system itself was quite low. Unfortunately, now the Liberals have lost market access to the tune of over $5 billion since 2015 in a relatively short time, and they have so far refused to take any meaningful action to support the struggling sector and the producers. And that, of course, has become even more acute in this period of pandemic and COVID-19. The Liberals have overseen a period in which farmers have lost more than $5 billion to export markets. Increased carbon taxes, I suggest, have also eaten into the cost itself for farmers. New regulations like livestock transportation rules have also made life more difficult. Red tape and new obligations being placed on the ag sector that aren't based on science. Some of which, and this is maybe speculation on my part, but some of which is pressure from activists, pressure from environmentalists who seem to have a completely unrealistic view, quite frankly, of the fact that there is no one on the planet who's more concerned about protecting and respecting the environment than those who work in the sector, the farmers themselves. So what I would suggest is that under a previous Conservative government, we did things that were entirely focused on helping farmers and our entire ag sector thrive. Things like dismantling the wheat board, negotiating major new trade deals with countries that would allow us access to their markets. That, to me, is one of the most important things that any government can do, identifying and opening up new markets. And, Erin, I say this humbly, we as a Conservative government signed more trade agreements than any government in the previous 50 years. And we had people like Jerry Ritz, a farmer himself, people like Ed Fast, who was very fast and hyper aggressive when it came to going around the world and opening up new opportunities for Canada, but specifically for our ag sector. And so all of that to say that, during this COVID period, it would appear that the government is telling farmers to drain their Agri-Invest accounts before offering any real assistance. It seemed almost that farmers were an afterthought. I know I'm sounding partisan here, but this indiscriminate spending that the current Prime Minister has undertaken during COVID has racked up a $343 billion deficit. Very recently we saw a $912 million grant for a charity that was supposed to deliver a student program that the public sector, the bureaucrats should have been delivering themselves. That's clear now based on the record that we've seen. And, half of that commitment to the WE charity would have dealt with the situation of the 85% level. So, I believe that there's no other group in Canada that's being told, hey, drain all of your own savings before you're going to get any help from the government during the pandemic. No one else is being told that, as far as I'm aware. And Canadian producers, Canadian processors, they should have and need a program that is going to be designed specific to cope with the fallout of COVID-19. And that is yet to happen. As an incoming government or prime minister, I want to see the books because we don't have clear transparency. We don't have the parliamentary budget officer getting all information. We don't have the auditor general, and we don't have regular sittings of parliament where you can have diligent MPs like Bob Zimmer and others who can say, all right, we want answers. We want the typical type of accountability that Parliament is supposed to represent. And then and only then would I suggest, you can make the proper adjustments. But all of this to say, Erin, this government has done everything they can to avoid taking that decision and making what I think is a necessary adjustment.
Thank you. May I ask you, for the benefit of our Quebec listeners, the same question in French? Les agriculteurs canadiens connaissent de nombreux hauts et bas. Et bien qu'ils espèrent ne pas avoir à la faire, ils recourent parfois aux programmes gouvernementaux de gestion de risques d'entreprise pour traverser les périodes difficiles. Les producteurs de grains du Canada ont souligné à plusieurs reprises au gouvernement fédéral que le programme Agri Stability est le moyen le plus efficace pour fournir un filet de sécurité à tous les types d'agriculteurs qui ont en besoin. Toutefois, le seuil de déclenchement et les paiements de ce programme ont été réduits en 2012 sur un précédent gouvernement conservateur. Par la suite, nous avons constaté que de nombreux agriculteurs ont tout simplement choisi de quitter le programme. En fait, le taux d'inscription à Agri Stability oscille autour de 30%. Au cours des dernières années, nous et d'autres secteurs avons demandé au gouvernement de ramener le seuil de déclenchement du programme à 85% et de supprimer les limites de la marge de référence. En tant que Premier ministre, seriez-vous prêt à rehausser Agri Stability et à améliorer les programmes de gestion de risques d'entreprise afin d'appuyer des agriculteurs qui ont en besoin?
Merci, Erin, pour cette question. Premièrement, c'est clair qu'on a besoin d'avoir la participation des gouvernements provinciaux. Et le paysage de l'agriculture sous le gouvernement libéral est bien différent de ce qu'il était en 2012. Le changement apporté au programme Agri Stability sous le dernier gouvernement conservateur sont intervenus à un moment où les agriculteurs ne connaissaient aucune perturbation du marché. En 2012, la différence était que le marché était au service des agriculteurs canadiens, ce qui est une bonne chose, et que la demande pour le programme Agri Stability était donc fiable. Aujourd'hui, les libéraux ont perdu l'accès au marché pour un montant de plus de 5 milliards de dollars depuis 2015 et ont jusqu'à présent refusé de prendre des mesures significatives pour soutenir les producteurs en difficulté pendant la pandémie de la COVID-19. Sous les libéraux, les agriculteurs ont perdu plus de 5 milliards de dollars sur le marché d'exportation, ont augmenté les taxes sur le carbone. Et pour moi, c'est une grande erreur. On a besoin de canceller la taxe sur le carbone au pays. Les libéraux ont adopté des nouvelles réglementations telles que les règles de transport de bétail et des formalités administratives non fondées sur la science. Les décisions pour l'agriculture et pour l'environnement, dans mon point de vue, c'est nécessaire de prendre la science, les faits actuels. Sous notre président gouvernement conservateur, nous avons démantelé la commission de blé et négocié de nouveaux marchés commerciaux importants. Notre gouvernement est très actif dans les efforts d'identifier et signer les nouveaux ententes des libres-échanges pour ouvrir les accès pour l'agriculture au Canada. Et pendant le COVID, les libéraux descendent aux agriculteurs de vider leur comprise agro-investissement avant d'offrir une véritable aide. Aucun autre groupe au Canada ne reçut l'ordre de vider ses économies avant de recevoir l'aide de ce gouvernement pendant la pandémie. Je suis très, très, très désolé la position du gouvernement libéraux dans le secteur, leur réaction pour le secteur agriculture. Et les producteurs et les transformateurs canadiens ont besoin d'un programme conçu spécifiquement pour faire face à la COVID-19 et à la structure commerciale unique de l'agriculture. Et c'est la clé, un programme et structure unique pour l'agriculture. Nous devons prendre des mesures pour aider les producteurs dès maintenant et fournir une assurance aux jeunes agriculteurs qui se lancent dans le secteur. Et peut-être finalement, les agriculteurs ont besoin des programmes qui fonctionnent et clairs, que l'approche unique est obsolète et je m'engage à offrir des programmes qui fonctionnent. Je pense que c'est tout. Et j'ai parlé avant peut-être les enjeux partisans et les décisions du gouvernement d'offrir un programme pour un groupe uni avec 900 milliards de dollars. Et pour le secteur d'agriculture, c'est clair, malheureusement, ce n'est pas une priorité pour le gouvernement au présent.
Thank you. I want to touch on something that you just said, and you talked about the importance of science-based policy. Part of your platform statement on science is critical to us. You know, we know that science, for example, is valued by the public in certain contexts, especially when it comes to solving the COVID crisis and our response to climate change. But often we find that it's ignored when it comes to regulations involving agriculture, for example. In fact, we see now a growing anti-science sentiment when it comes to topics like glyphosate and plant biotechnology innovations in Canada and around the world. As Prime Minister, what would you do to foster public trust in the ag sector regarding the use of plant breeding innovations and crop protection products and the regulatory system that drives it?
Well, this is a very important part. And as you mentioned, we've addressed this in my platform specifically. And I did a lot of consultation before we put those commitments forward and made these type of responses available on our website. But innovation, technology, changing practices has made Canada's agriculture sector extremely modern and, quite frankly, world-class, world-leading in many ways. And Canadians, I think, sometimes don't fully appreciate just how modern now our sector has become, using things like drones and using incredibly high-tech equipment to maximize the efficiency. I was on a dairy farm recently in Quebec, and it was amazing to see these cattle, these dairy cows, basically, and this sounds it sounds impossible to imagine, but dairy farmers will understand. They milk themselves. They know when it's time to go, and they enter into the part of the machinery that actually reads a number that's on their neck, a little collar, and tells that machine exactly how much milk to expect, and it's entirely automated. It is remarkable how efficient agriculture has become in many ways. So I would want to champion the effort to promote greater awareness of not only the importance of agriculture, but the efficiencies and all that is being done by the ag sector, again, to respect environmental stewardship, to work very closely to ensure that the highest standards of environmental protection are being met, and that those working in the ag sector fully understand and exceed Canadians' expectations about fighting climate change. Using the Canadian expertise and using some of these new techniques, I think we're seeing massive improvements in soil protection, water health, water recovery. Really, it's in farmers' interest to improve the yields, to improve the outputs so that they're doing their part to feed Canadians, but feed the world. And there are critical issues everywhere when it comes to food shortages. And so all of this is done in a very systematic way. It's intended to get from, as the saying goes, the farm gate to the grocery to the plate. And in a time of pandemic, this creates challenges, but it also has perhaps even highlighted the need to rely on these highly efficient new technologies, new methodologies. Technology has become this vital ingredient of modern farming. And that's also critical if we're going to be able to compete on a global market. We're not just competing amongst ourselves or amongst provinces now. This is very, very global standards of health and food, highest intentions vis-a-vis protecting the environment and meeting commitments. And if we don't continue down that track, we'll miss out on opportunities. We'll be left behind. Having said that, government's role isn't to stand in the way of those improved efficiencies. And if we keep seeing red tape, if we keep seeing unnecessary burdens and hurdles put up for farmers, this isn't going to help reach that maximum efficiency. I've spoken my campaign in the sector, but spoken of making Canada a technology powerhouse. And I believe that is very much part of not just the economic recovery, but it's part of many different sectors reaching their full potential. And creating this environment that will also attract investment, creating cutting edge technologies is going to give Canada, I think, that competitive advantage. And so to get there, we need to create an economic environment that'll attract investors, maybe repatriate Canadian technology in some cases, but also directing research investment, making it clear that there are dividends to be paid for high-tech jobs on the farm and elsewhere. We know that technology is going to help create jobs in the future. And so policy, to come back to your question and just round this out, Erin, policy proposals have to be based on sound science. Health Canada has to work with our agriculture and agri-food sector when they're conducting these type of decisions. And then in some cases, it also comes down to harmonizing regulations with global partners, so that, again, we can say with confidence that Canada's standards are among the highest in the world, that we are, ensuring that we're doing our part. And it's, as I said, it's naturally beneficial to the ag sector for pest resistance, for seed variety. We have, the ability now through satellites to decide the proper time for seeding. It is remarkable. And I don't pretend to fully, be able to articulate just how high-tech farming has become, but I've seen it recently. And I just don't think enough Canadians fully appreciate how much progress has been made, but how much more can be made if the government plays a more cooperative role.
Thank you. You touched on environmental stewardship, and I want to ask you to speak to something specifically in your platform. You state that farmers and ranchers are instinctive conservationists, and that farmers deserve credit for how they have reduced carbon emissions and fuel consumption through the modern practices that you're speaking of. We, of course, could not agree more, and are proud of our industry's record when it comes to our ever-improving sustainability practices and carbon sequestration. What role do you see agriculture playing in addressing a changing climate, and what sort of recognition can farmers expect if you become Prime Minister?
Well, I would say it clearly, and the statistics are clear. The facts are there. I mean, the agriculture, farming sector plays a critical role in Canada's effort to fight climate change. And that's why, as we were talking about just a moment ago, we need to have that science and those statistics to rely on. Unfortunately, you might be aware that the current Liberal government canceled some of the field research that was supposed to happen this year. And I think farmers, perhaps more than anyone, maybe fishermen fit into this category as well, are a bit leery of made in Ottawa solutions. But with technology, as we spoke of, the changing practices, the modern methodology of Canadian agriculture is already world class. And it's clear to me, and it should be to all Canadians, and you need the Prime Minister and the Ag Minister to be saying this often and loudly, farmers do all they can and all they should to protect the soil, the water, their livestock. That's their livelihood. There's nobody more deeply vested in ensuring that that's happening. And agriculture is not the cause of climate change, but it can be the solution. It can very much be part of the effort to combat climate change. So Canadian expertise in the field, we're seeing many improvements in the way that soil and in particular human health and water are enhanced by these modern practices. We're seeing greater yields of the food because of modern methodology. That helps Canada do our part to produce greater commodities that can help feed the world. And that should be a critical issue. Some of the other areas are food storage and having the necessary facilities at transport locations like, airports and seaports, where we need to sometimes store foods before they are sent off to their destination. That's also an important part of the government's role in improving infrastructure. But look, I know that agriculture is just such a vital pillar of our economy, and it has to be celebrated. It has to be presented to Canadians for what it is, a pillar, a critical part of our economy and our contribution to the world. And that includes environmental stewardship. That includes the very real commitment. And I say this of the fishery. Farmers and those in the fishery were making these decisions before they were told they had to. They were ahead of government bureaucracy and government legislation, again, out of that sheer recognition that it was incumbent upon them to be their best, to make the necessary adjustments, to be ahead of the curve. And so efficiencies in fertilizer, land use, maximizing the potential for the ag sector, sequestration around carbon, we know is an important part of every sector these days in terms of removing carbon from the atmosphere. All those best practices are being utilized by the vast majority of farms already, but they're also clearly interested and aware of their necessity to keep pace. And we should also look, it's been Canada's practice to look out into other jurisdictions and see what they're doing and try to emulate those practices here, just as many countries currently study what Canada's doing. We have, I say it again for emphasis, we have been world leaders in so many ways when it comes to our ag sector. So I know that we talk a lot and we hear a lot about the need to move towards zero emissions. Our ag sector is doing that. They're ahead of the talk. They're plain spoken, but mostly action oriented has been my experience being around farmers my whole life. The farm sector, I say, is not the problem, but is very much part of the solution, and they're doing their part.
Thank you. May I ask you the same question again in French? Dans votre plateforme, vous affirmez que nos agriculteurs et nos éleveurs sont des défenseurs de l'environnement et que les agriculteurs méritent amplement de crédit pour la façon dont ils réduisent leurs émissions de carbone et leur consommation de carburant grâce à des pratiques modernes. Nous sommes tout à fait d'accord et nous sommes fiers du bilan de notre industrie en ce qui concerne la fixation du carbone et les pratiques de durabilité qui sont en amélioration constante. Selon vous, quel rôle l'agriculture joue-t-elle dans la lutte contre les changements climatiques et à quel type de reconnaissance, de soutien des agriculteurs peuvent-ils s'attendre si vous devenez Premier ministre?
Merci, Erin. Le secteur de l'agriculture, depuis longtemps, fait le rôle important contre les changements climatiques. Et les statistiques ne pourraient pas être plus claires. L'agriculture jouait déjà un rôle essentiel dans notre lutte contre le changement climatique. Et grâce à l'innovation, à la technologie et à l'évolution des pratiques, l'agriculture canadienne moderne et de classe mondiale. Les agriculteurs font tout ce qu'ils peuvent pour protéger le sol, l'eau et leur bataille. C'est le gagne-pain. Grâce à l'expertise canadienne, nous constatons des améliorations massives de la santé des sols et de l'eau et de parlementaires. Nous constatons une amélioration des rendements, ce qui aide le Canada et le monde. Un problème crucial si cette pandémie entraîne des pénuries d'aliments. Je sais que l'agriculture est un pilier essentiel de notre économie et qu'elle doit être célébrée pour ses contributions et ses gestions de l'environnement. Nous devons travailler avec les producteurs pour accroître l'efficacité des engrais et des méthodes d'utilisation de terres, maximiser le potentiel des terres agricoles à séquestrateur, le carbone et veiller à ce que les meilleures pratiques suivant le rythme des progrès technologiques. Nous devons suivre les mesures précédentes d'autres pays et travailler avec le secteur privé pour établir des partenaires avec l'agriculture canadienne afin de développer des programmes de conservation, je m'excuse. Je crains qu'un adversaire de la campagne de prendre la direction opposée en parlant de zéro émission nette et d'un régime national de tarification réglementaire pour toute GES, y compris le méthane. C'est mauvais et préjudiciable pour nos familles d'agriculture qui travaillent fort. I neglected to say that in English, with respect to this issue around the need for government to play a role in helping our ag sector address these issues, it won't happen with a carbon tax. And I've committed very strongly at the federal level that we would remove the carbon tax. This has been a controversial issue, to say the least, in the ag sector, but everywhere. Provinces, in some cases, have taken the initiative to put it in place for their own. And some provinces, of course, are fighting it. But at a federal level, I don't believe in a carbon tax, and I don't believe in simply renaming it or calling it something else. A tax is a tax, and it is punitive, and it disproportionately affects, in a negative way, our ag sector. So that is something farmers can count on. We, the next Conservative government, would remove that carbon tax.
Thank you. You've been very generous with your time, so maybe just one final question, and I'll ask if you have any closing remarks.
Sure.
But staying on the topic of the environment, let's talk about the use of agriculture-based biofuel in Canada as a solution to help mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. Canadian canola, for example, is being used as quality feedstock for diesel biofuels here in Canada, the US, and in the European Union. In your opinion, could we create a more stable domestic market for Canadian canola by lowering greenhouse gas emissions, increasing the mandate for biofuel use in Canada, which currently sits at 2% for diesel? If so, how would that work, and would that be a priority for you as leader?
In short, yes. And as we look to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic, and thankfully we are seeing some bright spots now on the horizon, although there's been some flare-ups in some provinces. We're going to have to look at a variety of options to try to help industry, including the farm sector, to recover and fight climate change at the same time. It's this balance that we're always trying to strike. So investing in efforts to do that. Increasing the mandate for biofuels in Canada is certainly, I believe, an option that we have to commit to. My first priority to canola farmers across Canada is to regain some of the lost markets for their commodity. I think that's going to have the largest and most impact, and that will also restore stability to the sector. And also looking to more value-added processing in Canada, not just for canola, but I would say that of all commodities. And that this pandemic and the trade issues that we've talked about here, I think highlight the need for Canada to be more self-sufficient. I think we can be energy self-sufficient. I think we can certainly see more domestic market for our ag sector here with greater promotion from the government. And, you know, we spoke earlier of lost market access in places like Saudi Arabia, China. We can offset that, partly in domestic, but partly in new market access in big countries like India, but many others, including some in the Asia Pacific, places like South Korea, Japan, some of the smaller Asia Pacific countries I know are very interested in buying more Canadian ag product.
Thank you very much for that. We have covered a lot of ground in our time together today, and thank you very much for being so generous with your time today.
Could I add one last point, Erin? It just occurred to me. You know, we've talked a lot about at various stages here new technology and the necessity, well, the reality that the ag sector have embraced this. In order to truly capitalize on these new technologies, we need high-speed internet in rural parts of our country. 60% of Canadians still don't have access to high-speed internet. So that is something I'm very committed to as well. I just didn't want to miss that particular aspect of this discussion. And I know modern agriculture, for modern agriculture, it's essential to have that online access, as it is for all Canadians, quite frankly. There's a recognition because of COVID-19 where we're becoming more reliant on Zoom calls and Facebook Live, just like this, for things like mental health and health access generally, but just for communications purposes and for even marketing purposes. So technology on the farm is hugely important in order to fully become proficient and use all of those new technologies for monitoring soil, for some of those robots and drones that we've talked about that are now in use. That is predicated on high-speed internet as a tool, a further tool, just as important as a tractor or some of the other implements. And finally, we can't let China be the provider of that high-speed internet. It won't be Huawei under a conservative government.
Thank you for raising that with respect to connectivity. That was always an important issue for our members, but to your point, it's becoming increasingly important to them now, especially with respect to the pandemic and the need to stay connected and to support those very innovative and modern operations. Before I close, is there anything else that you wanted to touch on? I feel like we've had an opportunity to talk about a great deal, and for that, I appreciate your time.
Well, thank you, Erin. I believe we have covered a lot of ground. I would simply add that this is a priority for me. It's a priority in our platform. Having worked in the federal cabinet at a time when we were very active on trade files, I saw firsthand the importance of having an agriculture minister representative in government at the table during those trade discussions. That ensured that the interests of farmers were protected. And I would certainly look to name somebody who I knew had that depth of understanding and was going to play an important role. Somebody like a Jerry Ritz, who really had the trust of the Prime Minister and was tapped into the needs of the ag sector itself. So ensuring that the decisions that are being taken by Cabinet and the work that's being done externally to try to bring about new trade deals, to increase market access in big countries and small, that is very much part of my plan, and it's something I'm committed to. The Minister of Agriculture in any government that I would lead is going to be somebody who is experienced, will play a prominent role in both policy and legislative initiatives, And finally, as a guy who grew up in a rural setting myself, and a small farm, not a big commercial farm, to me it is second nature that we do everything we can to promote and protect our ag sector. It is absolutely critical now and in Canada's future that we continue to see a thriving agriculture sector in Canada.
I think that is a fine note on which to conclude our conversation today. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Erin. It's a real pleasure.
And thank you everyone for listening to this episode of Fireside Chats with Erin. We will be back again in 2 weeks' time with another special guest. In the meantime, if you want to stay up to date on all things GGC, please follow us on Twitter @Grain Growers or on Instagram @Canada's Grain Growers. Until then.